Hello, everyone. This is Aran. I'm an educator of philosophy based in Austin, Texas. Today, I'm going to have a conversation with my great friend Trent. Hello, Trent.
Hi everybody, this is Sean. I'm also based in Austin, Texas. I'm a cultural historian of early medieval Europe and the late medieval China. Glad to be with you all today.
So, what we're going to do today in this episode is to continue our discussion on the concept of human nature in conversation with evolutionary biology and how and if the concept of human nature can survive the de-essentializing attacks from evolutionary biology, meaning that evolutionary biology emphasizes on change and transformation and emergence and disappearance of traits, and it doesn't seem to fit any form of traditional conception of essences as past philosophers have understood it. And that's like the attack, and the question is whether there is a room for human nature that could embrace all of these transformations at the biological level and still maintain some stability for human condition. We have talked about this through discussing Grant Ramsey's book, Human Nature, and we have talked about John Dupré, and his precisional approach to a concept of human nature. And we're going to continue this discussion by talking about the developmental systems approach to human nature. Before doing that, let's do a very short summary of Dupré's idea of human nature. And as this episode unfolds, we're going to see how Dupré's approach is close to the developmental systems approach that we're going to discuss today. But we're also going to mention like how they differ and what is the context of their difference and why that might matter. Um, for Dupré, the point about human nature, the point about understanding what a species is, um, cannot be simply just looking at um, how different traits exist within a species. At least thinking about the existence of a species as some staple feature of that species is not giving us the picture of what this species is about. The way that we can think about this is that when we think about traits as exist in a here and now, which is the way that Ramsey seems to want to think about the concept of trait, at least in some places. It is as if you're taking a snapshot from um, a group of entities we have clustered together as a species. And then we're just going to say, okay, now that we're looking at this snapshot, how are the traits that exist here are kind of causally linked with one another? And this, in some ways, one might say, could give us like a horizontal view of like how things are connected. Um, the vertical line seems to be missing in this account. By vertical, I mean the difference between a snapshot and, a movie, right? And a way that something is being unfolding, where it's coming from and where it's going, right? Not only it might be difficult, even impossible, to even think about causal relation between traits without invoking the trajectories of how those traits came to be and where they are going. Um, but also some traits could be actually disappearing from that snapshot just because they're not present at that specific snapshot. So this point about um, adding elements of process to our understanding is not an arbitrary choice just out of, say everything could be process or substance, we just choose the substance, choose this process. The idea is that once we exclude the developmental trajectory of traits in entities such as ourselves, we lose track of understanding of what the meaning of those traits are. And again, when we are thinking about like a specific snapshot of humanity, human beings could be at different stages, right? Stages of development. And when we're like looking at like one image, it's very uncanny if you think about like what does that tell us about humanity as a whole, unless we understand that this is only a stage of, right? So when we introduce the idea of this is not just a trait, this is a stage of so and so, the whole language of traits goes through a fundamental transformation. This could be related to the idea that traits as these kind of free-floating items that are connected to one another in weird ways might be, some way, some words are connected to one another, right? But if only you're looking at the maps of how words are connected to one another, that doesn't give you the language. The language is still missing. And not only the grammar is missing, the cultural context is missing, right? You can go to like a very kind of etymological approach and just kind of look at how words connect to one another, but that doesn't tell you what the language is. And I think that's the essence of the problem that Dupré has with someone like Ramsey. Also, Dupré thinks that once this can of worms of developmental trajectories is opened, and once we understand that one of the fundamental features of humanity is, or one of some of like quote unquote fixed features of humanity are stuff that are related to intelligence or creating learning environments, then there is no way that we can agree with evolutionary psychologists that there is some sort of a substratum that, like everything else, is just like within that substratum. There is no, in other words, core of a humanity independent from all of these developmental trajectories that could be and have been developed throughout history that we can just go back as the point of explanation for everything else, right? The point is, according to Dupré, or based on what Dupré says, that speaking of that basic features is really an empty thought, meaning that you can go ahead and say that, we are doing so and so because it is, the core of it is this kind of evolutionary pressure. But if the evolutionary pressure has created something like, this distance for us from our impulses and our ability to kind of like learn in various ways, then unless you start studying the actual developmental trajectories based on different learning systems, your idea of what a human being is always going to be lacking, or is going to be always just like limited to this very generic, general judgment that, oh, it's all about evolutionary restrictions or evolutionary pressures or constraints. So that's Dupré. Trent, do you have something to add to Dupré?
No, I think it was a very good summary. Let's just move forward.
Perfect. And in that is, I think you can introduce us to and the main character we're going to talk about. That is going to be very similar to Dupré in some ways, but very different in important ways that may not be that important immediately, but they're going to become very important when we kind of continue with this conversation exploration with Trent. Um,
Yeah,
Griffiths,
yeah, yeah,
developmental system approach. Trent, tell
yeah,
us
yeah.
about it.
So the article we read on the developmental approach is drafted by Paul Griffith and another person called Stotz. I forgot his first name, but I'm gonna only introduce Griffith because he published a huge body of literature on this specific topic, sometimes with Stotz, sometimes alone, sometimes with other intellectual partners. So Paul Griffiths is an Australia-based and Cambridge-trained philosopher of science, but also a kind of a medical scientist himself. He runs two really interesting projects, like in parallel. One, he takes a substantial role in establishment of the Charles Perkins Center, which is a research institute dedicated to easing the global burden of obesity, cardiovascular diseases, and related conditions. So it's really like medical scientist in his profession and training. But on the other hand, he is also leading a theory and method, like a think group. It's kind of a think thought leader to reflect on the social construction, the ethics, and policy making connected with the biomedicine. So either way, it's quite clear that unlike Dubray, we introduced who is like more a philosopher, Griffiths has very clear. His research really tries to bring about tangible social changes, and I think that distinction perhaps matters later on when we try to imagine the potential implications of their relationship with Griffiths' trait cluster theory. So for Griffith, developmental environment would be something perhaps much closer to our common sense of that stuff. We already take certain, for instance, individual ailments that are grounded, like obesity, and think about what are the factors like mass media, like distribution, education, as well as like medical treatment that can address that situation. So I think with this context set, Aran, will you take us to like what his developmental system approach is really about?
I think that's a very interesting summary, because I think when we kind of, as you said, when we talk about the differences between Griffiths and Dupré, it's interesting that there is this, just sometimes people say like when you want to be like a successful therapist, you're not necessarily need to be the best, theoretical psychologist. Like the people who help others might need to use different models than people who want to kind of represent what is actually the case. And I think that might be some explanatorily at least reliable way to think about the differences, some differences between Griffiths and the Dupré. So the element that the Dupré brought to us was the element of process, and the element of process is with us with Griffiths. Griffiths himself thinks that Ramsey's approach, the faith cluster approach, is a pretty successful approach, but the emphasis is like for Ramsey on describing the property clusters, right? Ramsey goes to like humanity and says that, oh, okay, look at the cluster of traits that we have, and look at how they're kind of connected to one another. What the emphasis of the developmental system approach is how these clusters, what processes were needed for these clusters to kind of come together. And I think this is like something that might be interesting kind of in conversation with the metaphor that I introduced about language, because I'm not even sure that like the point that Griffiths has here is necessarily the same as the point that I was trying to make with language. And I think that might be something important, because the way I introduced this was this idea that, okay, you have words, these words are clustered together, they're like synonyms, or they are like they're derived from one another, they are related in these certain ways, but like having a map of that, it doesn't give you language, you need all sorts of other things. Now, how these come about as relations, that's one way to think about this map is not enough, right? But think about syntax and cultural context, that could be a different layer. I'm just mentioning this to just see whether like what Griffiths is talking about is just about, okay, we have the property clusters. How did it come about? Or what does it even mean? And I think those are different questions, right? Because you can say, oh, here are the traits. We know what these traits are. We know they're clustered. Why don't you tell me how they come together in this way? And that's a valid question. And that's a valid question in terms of like, oh, look at the processes that make them come together. But that's not the same question as saying that, hey, by pointing at a cluster of traits, you are not telling me what they are. I'm not sure if Griffiths is ready to make that claim, that the meaning of these traits itself is jeopardized by the fact that they are part of these processes, right? It seems to me that there is something fixed in Griffiths that, okay, here are the property clusters. How do they come about? And that might be something that is relevant in the distinction and understanding not only the distinction between Dupré and Griffiths, but also what problems we might have with this. I will add one more thing, and then Trent, you can jump in and tell us what you think about all of this. That's just like Dupré, Griffiths is also very interested in the context of environment. And I think it's in general a question of like thinking about what kind of traits are environmental traits, right? Because I don't think Ramsey has any problem of introducing the concept of environment. And it's true that developmental systems is very much like maybe more interested in articulating the importance of environments in the development of certain characteristics in human beings. But again, I'm not sure how this core of traits developing and the environment really come together in Griffiths, meaning that, just like what I said for the property clusters and the processes, you can say that, okay, here are the traits, here's the environment where these traits can exist, right? And that's an underlying conditions kind of approach. Here's another way that you can think about this. The environment changed what those traits are, period. It's not that it is just like the traits are fixed, the environment is fixed. When they come together independently, we have this new phenomenon, right? It's that they are constantly redefining each other, right? So I wonder how much for Griffiths, these domains are already separated and well defined, and they're coming together as like self-sufficient wholes. And you're like, yeah, of course, these kind of like genes only develop in these types of environments, and we need to talk about those environments because those are the underlying processes, right? As opposed to saying that, hey, this distinction itself is a problem, right? This kind of a sharp distinction between, oh, here are the things that are now going to get to this environment that is external to them. They're going to develop there. That doesn't tell us the relationship between entities and their environment, right? That's not putting them all on the same ground. They're still just kind of like not in conversation. So Trent, do you have
Yeah. I really liked the 2 points you made. The first one, I think, what you introduced us in this episode is really helpful. The difference between snapshots and the movies, and I think Griffiths is like taking Ramsey's account, say, wow, this is just a cluster of snapshots. It's not persuasive enough. It's not satisfactory, but we just need a single twist to turn into a movie. So provided we use like a projector or whatever, and we show each snapshot like very rapidly, then we got like a continuous movement of thing. And he wants to convince us, at least himself, that is reality. And and the second point is also really important. I think like Griffith, in my reading, kind of like relegate essentialism from the species itself to the environment by kind of essentializing the environment as a collective, boundless entity that surrounds the manifestation of traits, without really, am I suggesting, helpful ways to justify what he later will discuss about the niche construction, the boundary between niche and the further environment. It seems to me very clearly that he is trying to use a concept of natural selection and bring it to supplement Ramsey's account to make time, and which is essential for speciation and evolutionary biology, central to this cluster trait theory. So because the dominant theory about ancestry and inheritance across members of species within one is through genetic reproduction. Therefore, that, at least in my eyes, explains why genes is assumed as a starting point to make sense of this consistency or stability across time. So, for instance, here might be helpful to introduce, not introduce, but to bring Dupré into the picture. That is not really clear what is the starting point of his call of process. It could be this, could be that, but for Griffiths, it's very clear. It's because the need to explain genetic inheritance that he feels the needs of introducing the concept of environment and development to merge like individual life history according to Ramsey to like species like natural history. Yes, that's my understanding.
Yes, and I think it's interesting that like it's this we're gonna have you're gonna bring forward your interesting metaphor in a second in terms of like how Griffiths and Dupré are different here, but like to get there, I think it's important to kind of like re-emphasize this whole point about niche construction because you mentioned it here as well, right? Because like for Griffiths, it's very important to say that okay, here are the solely gene-based stuff. Here's the environment, right? And so that distinction exists in that way. And the distinction kind of shows itself in the concept of niche construction. And it's a fascinating concept. We talked upon it with Dupré, but I think the example that Griffiths presents is very important in terms of kind of giving us an idea about like how the influence influence of environment is meaningful in the process. So he says, imagine trying to determine the real nature of an ant, another powerful niche constructor, but removing the influence of the nest on the developing egg and embryo. The result would be either dead or biologically meaningless. And so it's for humans. So the idea for Dupré and Griffiths is that niche construction is something that basically entities, biological entities being able to change their environment, and that change really opens doors for them to be something, right? That is not just something that if you like throw an ant into the world, or like an ant is born and you isolate the ant, right, and just analyze its traits, it's just like it's not gonna give you the point about nest. Like it's very important that the ant is born into a nest that has this specific structure and this kind of a, in a primitive sense, a culture, a system of relations existing within which this ant is introduced, right? Outside this hierarchy within the colony, this ant, what this ant is biologically meaningless, right? But it's still like what we see in this, and again, like you can see that like how just like Dupré, this could mean that in the case of us, you know, we do a lot more than nests, right? And how that could really change what kind of an individual we end up being, or what layer of humanity we can articulate or even expand. And both of them, I think, agree on that. But going back to what we have already touched upon, Griffiths is very adamant in telling us that there are layers, right? And which means which feels like in some ways a commonsensical maybe, But I think it's important to see that difference that exists with Dupré and could exist with other accounts. The developmental systems account, Griffiths tells us, looks for genetic, epigenetic, and exogenetic constraints on developmental trajectories. And this suggests to us that there is a clear path in distinguishing these, right? The language that Griffiths is using is not that there are constraints and it's a mess. That's not how he speaks of this. There are constraints and they're kind of like ordered. And I think that's the point that Trent, your metaphor is going to help us understand what is happening here.
Yes. Before I introduce yet another parable, perhaps I need to, or this is more metaphor than parable, as I want to react to what you said, and actually what you said in the last slide, which I didn't really address, is I think one main frustration Griffith has with Ramsey's model is in Griffith's eyes, you cannot just have, for the matter of human nature, you cannot just have a purely descriptive model. Any purely descriptive model is implicitly causal, and it's our responsibility to make that explicit. For instance, let's continue with this quote you have on the slide, niche construction. Let's imagine like a species of an ant. And Ramsey would go and like observe that ants like traits. For instance, that the ant is in a symbiotic relationship with a kind of mushroom that keeps the moisture of their like colony to allow them to survive, say, in desert. And if you move that colony into a laboratory and you maintain through machine the moisture, and which kills the mushroom, and the ant could survive without the mushroom because you maintain the right temperature and moisture. And for Ramsey, that is not to say the trait of being in a symbiotic relationship with a specific mushroom is no longer part of the nature of this ant. It's just unrealized. Griffiths will say, how then do you recognize this? It's only because you recognize the existence of this species in close proximity to the ant's colony is a necessary condition for survival for this ant. And you're already thinking evolutionary term. You're not just looking at this moment. Therefore, you call it unrealized trait instead of a irrelevant trait, or it's not a trait at all. Therefore, you cannot just have a purely descriptive model. You must bake reserve space for causal explanation. Otherwise, you cannot recognize and describe traits at the first place. I think, at least personally, I am in line with that. But I think Griffiths kind of departs from Graham Ramsey's adamant warning against a core veneer or nature culture divide criticism in his causal model, which is designed perhaps to supplement Graham Ramsey's descriptive model. That is, there is kind of a natural hierarchy baked into the mechanisms which are inherited within one specific species across the generation. And the prime mover, perhaps, of his cosmos is genes. So that's why when Griffiths tries to develop this model of developmental systems, there's a clear starting point. It's a genetic inheritance. And based on other systems or mechanism which preserves behavioral patterns or surviving conditions across generation within the same species, they are measured and categorized in relationship to this prime mover. For instance, if you have specific, at the molecule level, you have a certain like parasite in human gut that could be transmitted across generation through breastfeeding. That thing does not play into a human DNA sequence, but is necessary for the function of certain proteins in human digestive system, and without it, the human would die. That would be called epigenetic because it's already very, very close at the molecule level to human body and ecosystem. But the very act of parenting or breastfeeding as a cultural phenomenon for him will be exogenetic because it does not correlate with genetic reproduction in any direct way. And that classification model really helps in policymaking in like a pragmatic method, but I think is really convincing to me personally as a grounding metaphysical or philosophical system to explain stability of a species across generation. It seems like there's a clear layer of ingredients, basically. If a human being is one container, it definitely looks like a cake. You have a base layer is a sponge, and on top of which you have cream, on top of which you have cherry on top. And like a gene for like Griffith's model is that flour that makes the sponge cake. You cannot make a cake without flour. That's why you cannot think about like stability across time without thinking about the genes. Species as well as natural selection, genetically based natural selection is a fundamental to his system. However, if you contrast the Griffiths model of so environment in this sense is really stuff outside genes, basically, but necessary for a species, or in this case, human survival or flourishing. But if you contrast him with Jean Dupré, we're probably comparing a cake with cherries on top with a cocktail, which contains different like elements. There's like a base liquid spirit, and you mix it with like water, like sweetener and bitter, whatever, to make a cocktail. But for Dupré is like it's very unclear what's the starting point of this cocktail, or whether it is meaningful at this stage to say because this happens first, or because it's prime mover, therefore it's most fundamental to human existence. No, it's really constant change and negotiation of a trajectory of change within this body of fluid that gives you a distinct taste, and therefore like that is the image I have in mind when comparing like Dupré and Griffith. Like Griffith in his, I think, adamant advocation of the Gramsci's the cluster trace model actually departs from the very important insight Ramsey tries to impress upon us, namely, we should get rid of that nature-culture divide, Courvoisier issue. I think with the introduction of natural hierarchy of mechanisms of introducing or maintaining stability across generation, Griffiths kind of reintroduces that Courvoisier distinction. And I think John Dupré's model perhaps is more in line with Ramsey in that regard. So that's all I gotta say with the two imageries.
Yes, that's great, and I think there are a lot of things about this kind of a cocktail cake model distinction is going to still be with us when we're trying to go back to some of those basic problems that we had with Ramsey in terms of like the causal train, and what does it really mean to really like not think about nature and culture as you know just two things that are layers that are different, but they impact one another. But think of them as like a flux that the distinction between them is not shouldn't be taken too seriously. And or there is a reason for maintaining this cake model, and there is a justification for this level of analysis. We don't see that justification in Griffiths, at least. We don't see him to just tell us like why we need to have the cake model as opposed to the cocktail model. So that remains an open question. So what we the way we want to finish this is just to tell you what is ahead of us. And basically, what's going to happen in the next episode is that like we have talked about like maybe three main like some of the main figures in the strictly speaking evolutionary biology human nature kind of intersection, and we want to see like how, speaking of the developmental system approach and Dupre's approach, and Ramsey himself kind of now gives us like reshapes our understanding of human nature and how this evolutionary biology um, criticism of the traditional conceptions of human nature um, could mean that, or doesn't mean that we need to get rid of the concept of human nature altogether, but that we need to reconstruct it. So we want to see how what these precisional developmental approaches uh, add to our understanding of human nature, add to what Ramsey has said, and how it could help us reconstruct the whole concept of trait, which we think is pivotal in reconsidering the concept of human nature. And of course, we will also discuss what remains unresolved in our view, even in the precisional and developmental approaches to human nature. Trent?
Yes, I think with that said, we can just conclude this episode. Dear listener, thanks for staying with us and stay attuned. Our critical reflection upon the processional or developmental process models of human nature is coming up.